This is going to be an incredibly exciting interview for me. I hope also for you, John, because I was truly looking forward to being able to get into all of these subjects with you. I want you to be able to take a moment to introduce yourself, but I do want to say first that the email that I got from you about, here, I have it in front of me, that the review copy arrived 10 minutes ago, was the most literal hot off the press email I think I've ever received, which was very exciting. Like, boom, it's here. But I can't wait to talk to you today about your newest book, because you're a prolific writer, but your newest book, If Scientology Ruled the World, Sex Magic, Nazi Occultism, Space Aliens, and the Second Coming. So it's, light summer reading.
And give it to all your friends for Christmas as well.
Christmas. Right. It's a stocking stuffer. And so I cannot wait to get into it. It was one of these books everyone listening has to get. Just be prepared, though. You will not be able to put it down, which was my problem during the last couple of weeks after I received this. So, John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's lovely to see you, Rachel.
Yeah, always nice. And you've been a wonderful guest on the show, and people are familiar with you and familiar with your work. But for anyone listening to you for the first time, if you don't mind just taking a few moments and introducing yourself, and then we'll start talking.
Not at all. I've spent a lifetime studying authoritarianism, people bullying other people, and I'm against it. I think it's a bad idea. That started with a 9-year involvement with the so-called Church of Scientology, where I was a customer, what they call public, and I was treated as a celebrity, so I was treated very nicely. And at the end of 9 years, I left because I thought that L. Ron Hubbard had died and Scientology had been taken over, and we had to make it friendly again because it had become very mean. And a few months into being at the middle of the independent movement in the UK, I completely lost faith in Ron Hubbard. I saw material that incontrovertibly showed that he was a liar. He contradicted himself. And I found hundreds of instances of this as I looked out, back through material. So I became a biographer of Hubbard, a historian of Scientology. It's still startling to me that there are so few histories of so-called cult groups, of destructive cult groups. There are a lot of personal accounts, a lot of autobiographies, which are very useful, very valuable. But to actually put together the information and show how a group developed. I mean, John Collins' work about the Branham cult is an attempt at history, as my work is. And from the moment that I left, I was flooded by people who felt they'd been harmed by Scientology and had been harmed. And it just, I was in at the deep end trying to help people without really knowing how to do that. And I found that it's exceptional for somebody to be in your position, that somebody who understands counselling and understands the dynamics of cult involvement. So I didn't find anybody, until I met Christian Schurko, who actually knew how to counsel former members. They would just take their kind of cookie cutter, one size fits all method and try and apply it. Oh, it was because, you had a bad childhood or, whatever.
Right.
And at the other end, using, cognitive behavioral therapy, you've got to get into where the cognitive mess is coming from. So that led me to develop a form of information counselling, as our friend Steve Hassan has called it. That's where I got it from, as opposed to process counselling. So what I was looking to do was to get the person to realise that the leader of whichever cult they're involved in was not a divine presence, was not infallible, was human, and that by understanding that this person was also not their dad or their mum in some cases, that the authority that they were granting to this person, transference as analysts would call it, bless them, the authority that they were transferring was not deserved. And getting somebody to crack the cultic shell, to realise that we are allowed to think for ourselves and to come to their own determinations and decisions. So I've spent, I've studied terrorism, I've studied gangs, I've studied, 100 cult groups from the old mystery cults, more than a millennia BC through to the present day, and found that there are dynamics that exist in all of these groups, and those dynamics are authoritarian. They're somebody who claims to have the truth about everything, and they're going to sell it to you at the cost of everything you've got fundamentally, and you will end up emptied out by them. So a lot of that went into an earlier book called Opening Our Minds, which looks at these dynamics as they are. My friend Lady Daphne Vane, when many years ago talking with my late friend, she said, cults, it's in your mother's milk. It's part of the society. As Margaret Singer, one of the books she wrote with Jan Jeleilich, cults in our midst. And I remember talking with her and saying, it's because we are just intersecting shells of cults in our society. There is no rational centre. There is no group of people who are absolutely trustworthy. There is a group of people who are absolutely untrustworthy, and they're called politicians. But, sorry about that. In this case, it led me back to the origins of most of the 20th century cults, most of the New Age, which I hadn't really expected to find. But accidentally, I stumbled into Madame Blavatsky.
Right, which I certainly want to be able to talk about. She's been an interesting figure for so many of us in this field, but for you to be able to see her to a great degree as the origin story has been really incredible. Also, without the intention, I think, potentially of where it all went, but people will add their own intention to it and use the material for their gain if that's what they feel they need to do or their ego needs for them to do. When you're talking about gangs, I may have mentioned this story to you, but there was a time years ago when I was teaching a class at USC, and there were lots of young people in the class, and then an older gentleman in the back who was covered in tattoos on his face, his body, and wasn't talking to the other people in the class all so much, but was taking, copious amount of notes. And so after the class, I just went up to him and I said, I feel you have a story. And he said, oh, I do. And I said, I don't mean to single you out in this way, but it's because other people were joining in and asking questions, sharing about their lives. And I also noticed that you weren't. I'd love to find out more if that's okay. So I sat down, pulled up a chair, and we sat down and talked. He had been raised in gangs. And then because he had to prove himself in the gangs, he had to commit crimes because this was his family. He didn't have a family really growing up. And these were people who supposedly were going to be watching out for him. So he felt connected and he felt protected. And then he was arrested. And then in jail, he had to join a gang for his own protection.
Yeah.
And so within a system, a controlled system, you're in another controlled system, and it becomes this Venn diagram. And it's very hard to break free from all of that. He was now becoming a counselor, and he had set an appointment for tattoo removal, which he knew was going to be actually very painful. No. But then he sent me a photo of himself after the tattoo removal. And he said, and with description underneath the photo with him with face tattoos and body tattoos, he said, this was my way of saying, I don't feel safe in the world. Leave me alone.
Yeah.
Not, I want to hurt you, but don't hurt me, which was really interesting, that people might not have that insight into what that means sometimes. And then he had gotten married in the meantime, had a little boy. And so suddenly, without his face tattoos and holding this little 1-year-old, was a completely different person, at least on the outside. So it's judging a book by its cover, but also misjudging a book by its cover in this very fundamental way. Are you trying to be offensive or defensive? But also, what is it about our world that puts people and pits people into these two spaces, the kill or be killed? Because I feel like there's so much about what we talk about with cults, with L. Ron Hubbard, with a lot of these leaders, where it is so primal, and I think my bias is so immature. When I think about people who are able to be tolerant of others, accepting of others, open to other races, open to other religions, I see them as adults. When they're not, I see them as children because they have that rigidity and fear and needing to feel superior because it's rooted in insecurity, but they need to just sort of suppress everyone and raise themselves up on the backs of others. And I just see that as being a child. But so many of these children, psychologically, become these very intimidating and really, unfortunately, sometimes charismatic leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. I've spoken a couple of times at conferences where there were survivors of right-wing extremist groups, violent, even neo-Nazi groups, and met some remarkable people and heard some remarkable stories, which are often that in childhood they were bullied into a group and then they were bound into that group. And you've got the simple one that so many gangs use, which is they get you to commit a crime and then they tell you they'll report you if you do. And you're watching people become entrapped in that system. As you say, it's about maturity, and I think possibly everything is. I'm 70 now. I'm hoping that somewhere in my 80s, I may grow up a little. I've been working at it. But I think that, you have to become your own parent, something like that. You have to take on complete responsibility for yourself and the world and your opinions and the consequences of your opinions. And so many people, as Eric Fromm said, they don't develop a self. They, he blamed Nazism on that in his book Escape from Freedom. And putting aside his ridiculous views of homosexuality, which were absolutely normal among the psychiatric and psychotherapeutic profession, very sadly, during that time. But putting that aside, he's generally very sensible in saying, so this can lead to malignant narcissism, where somebody doesn't have a self. And as he says, he corrects Freud and says, no, narcissism doesn't mean that you only love yourself. Narcissism means that you don't know how to love. And I think that's the immaturity. That's the fundamental immaturity, that when you start to take delight in helping other people, you're starting to grow up. When and we know it from having children that I can remember my 6-month-old son, my first son, waking me up at some ludicrous hour in the morning, kicking me in the throat, and that anger that you wake with, and then the realization that, and that's a step towards being an adult, to growing up, to saying, I need to be responsible for my emotions and I need to wear something protective around my neck,
Right, exactly. Right, or strategically placed pillows. Right, that should take care of our relationship. Right. Yeah. No, it's very hard. I remember when I was pregnant and I went to lactation class. But I remember this nurse saying, oh, you're going to be up every 2 to 3 hours. Meanwhile, I was going to be working full time in Manhattan, taking the subway, the train, and walking. And you're going to be up every 2 to 3 hours nursing, and then burping the baby, changing the baby. And then you might get another hour or two, and then you're going to be up again. And I thought she was joking. I thought, how am I going to? And then suddenly, here I am getting up in the middle of the night, exhausted. But actually, I had the thought, oh, good, it's going to give me a chance to visit this cute little squishy person I love. And I thought, ooh, that's different. That's different than what I thought I was going to be feeling. And so, yes, you hope that happens. And what's also interesting, I find, is this idea of L. Ron Hubbard and others just changing how they feel from book to book, thought to thought, day to day. I think because the content doesn't matter sometimes as much as the fact that people need to believe whatever it is they say. And I feel like it's in the power of, I'm going to tell you to jump and your response needs to be how high, no matter what. Because if I feel like I have a piece of information that's helpful, I'll want it to be consistent. So it's consistently helpful. I won't just change it just to see if people will go wherever I decide to take them. It's a very different reasoning. It's very different intention.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be political, but I was truly shocked to the marrow last November when I saw a US senator say that however high, if Trump asked him to jump, he would say, how high? And you're kind of going, look, I don't care about politics. You know,
Right.
so many politicians are corrupt, and they're basically looking to be elected and so on. And among them are the best of people as well. Let me put that in. But the idea that anybody in Congress represents the president rather than the Constitution and the people is absolutely odious. But it shows us that this culture of submission, again, I mean, it's a quotation, so it seems fair. Donald Trump has said that people divide into predators and prey. That's all there are, predators and prey. Now, I do not and will not believe that. I believe that predators need to be restricted because they are dangerous. And I believe that those people who see themselves as prey, some psychologists call them echoists. I'm not happy with that. But those people who see themselves as prey need therapy. And in between should be the mass of humanity where we are not predators taking from others, and we are not prey submitting to others, where we are independent and capable of decision and capable of resistance. I was talking with a friend, Professor Steve Moffick, who is an emeritus professor of psychiatry, and he was talking about moral injury and this sense that if you don't stand up against evil, then you commit a moral injury to yourself. And this is a really interesting thought, that the psychological problems that might come from keeping your mouth shut, from not rocking the boat. And, you know, I can't recommend blowing whistles personally. I had a pretty difficult time of it, standing up against Scientology, and the daily harassment for 16 years after I left was difficult. So I can't recommend it. There's a thing called the Stetson effect, where a member of the famous Hat family put forward the idea that, so if somebody says something racist and you don't feel that you can oppose it, at least don't smile when they say it. And I've seen, and I'm not naming any names, I've seen experts in our own field actually nod and smile when awful things were said to them, because it seemed the polite thing to do. So even somebody such as you or me, who should know better, may feel inclined to simply, you know, go with the flow and do something. And I think we have to resist that. I think we have to be decent and friendly in our approach, non-hostile in our approach. I must admit, I upset a friend of mine a few years ago when he said he didn't think the Holocaust had happened. And it's just one of those topics for me. And he pointed out to me that I was getting angry with him and it wasn't helpful. And he was right. But, it's something that should cause us indignation.
Yeah, I agree.
So, yeah.
I absolutely, there are some things I won't just let stand. I do need to say something, especially when I think that there is something so rooted in hatred. And I don't know if sometimes when people are saying what they're saying, they realize that it's so rooted in hatred. And so I try to be very socially appropriate. But it is
quite right.
also true. I'm going to pinky up when I, drink tea.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Of course.
And always start with your cutlery from the outside.
Right? Thank
Yeah.
you. But glad we got that out of the way. Okay, I'm going to cross that off
Emily
my list.
Post, yeah.
Yes, right. But I do think that, like, I think about so many people who are these thinkers that I appreciate will talk about people's silence and what that does, and holding back and not saying, not speaking up, not taking that risk. Even when I worked at schools, when I was doing teaching, the children who were bullied, they remember the bully to a certain degree, but what they remember more is being knocked to the ground and looking up and seeing the friends' faces being passive, just looking and not helping them up, not standing in the way of the bully, but just being there. And it feels like they're allowing it to happen. Sometimes for their own safety, they're not getting involved. But those are the things that a lot of children will remember, just seeing their friends, just stand idly by. That makes sometimes even a bigger impression.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to misquote because I don't remember the quotation, but Martin Luther King said words to the effect that it is not the evil people who are the danger in the world, it is the mediocre people. It's the people who stand by and let it happen, because, the predators are always, thankfully, going to be in a minority, and they derive their power. And this book has really put me very close to that. They derive their power from belief. So 45% of medical doctors joined the Nazi Party. Very highly trained, very highly educated, and one would hope intelligent. And they were willing to submit their intelligence to really the lowest common denominator. When you look at Adolf Hitler, there is nothing clever. There is nothing thought through in Hitler's, what I've managed to read of his writings. I must admit that Mein Kampf is a little too much for me, but he doesn't offer anything. There's no science, and yet it's put forward as if it were science. And so we get the Aryan race fantasy. And I had not intended to find out anything about history. I'd intended to piece together, the information I had about Ron Hubbard, about, the New Age and cults. And I found that to my own amazement, that I'd wandered into an area which is not talked about. And so looking at the Nazis and the development of Nazi belief, I have just one principle, and it's inspired me for years. It's misattributed to Voltaire, and he did say something incredibly complicated that could be reduced to this. But if people believe absurdities, they're prone to committing atrocities. Mm-hmm. And understanding how, we have this kind of the pro-cult apologists, these academics who B. Schofield has dished it to in the last week or two, bless her, who have supported groups like the Children of God, for example, where child abuse was normalized. So you have somebody like Gordon J. Melton, who went and testified on their behalf, and as wrote supportively about them, wrote a pro-Scientology book. And when I wanted to discuss that book with him and said, let's take it paragraph by paragraph, and I will show you my evidence because you're wrong, he didn't want to do it. So he'd retired now, and he wanted to write a book about vampires. And then he told me that he was going to write another book about Scientology, but he'd given his box of materials to Janet Reitman and she hadn't returned them. And I said, you can have my 60 boxes of materials. No, help yourself. But
right, yeah.
And finding that attitude, which is basically, look, we're liberals, so people can believe what they like. Yeah, I agree with that. People can believe what they like. But if those beliefs translate into actions which harm other people, then I don't like it. And if, we have this difference between the US and the UK in law, we do have such a thing as hate speech here, and it is against the law. So when I was writing a chapter with Steve Hassan on which got into right-wing extremism in the US, and I started looking at websites, and I could not believe the language, the use of words which I'm not going to use here. No. But this attitude of superiority that you mentioned, these people feel themselves in some way special, as all cult members do. Yeah. And the Aryan race fantasy is crucial. And yet I've never seen anybody explain the etiology of it. How did it develop? Where did the Nazis get this from? And you've got some of the later steps. Professor Nicholas Goodrick Clark in The Nazis and the Occult, an excellent study. He shows the later stages of it, and he points back to Blavatsky. And curiously, he actually wrote a book about Madame Blavatsky, which in fact edited highlights of Blavatsky's work. And I was quite surprised, having read 3 of his scholarly works, to find that he didn't disagree with anything that Madame Blavatsky was saying. So his beliefs had coloured the way that he looked at the Nazis, and how truly silly the Aryan race fantasy is. Nobody seems to have got to that. And you've got all of these neo-Nazis, white supremacists, white nationalists in the US who haven't understood the Aryan race fantasy. So you'll have people whose antecedents are in Poland, for example, who are now white nationalists. And you go, well, you can't be, because the Slavs were the true Untermensch, the Slav slave, as far as the Nazis were concerned. So I'm afraid if your heritage is not Scandinavian, British, German, Dutch, Swiss, I'm sorry, you can't be an Aryan. But looking at what the Nazis did, and it was a very deep dive. I hadn't intended to do this. I thought I can knock a book off in about 3 weeks, because I've been studying the Nazis and occultism for 40 years. I was studying Scientology 50 years. It would be easy. And it required more reading than I've ever had to do in my life. Some amazing things. Peter Staudenmayer's incredible doctoral work talking about how anthroposophy was hijacked by the Nazis, and Steiner's very nationalistic, pro-German views, and how, the end of that story, which I don't get to in this book, is that Silicon Valley, they now send their kids to Waldorf schools. They don't let them have devices, and they send them into Steiner schools as if that was a rational thing to do. Sorry about that, but he was a nutcase. In 1913, one of the things I found, and again didn't report it in the book, in 1913 he made a statement that children were now going to be vaccinated so they wouldn't be able to have spiritual thoughts. Now, for somebody who was an anti-vaxxer, that's quite a, where had he leapt to that you're going to be able to find some antibody to spiritual thinking? What on earth was going on in his head?
Yeah. I mean, it really, I think just in terms of our talk today, there's so much to cover. And what I'm thinking about is that sort of at the halfway mark of our talk, and we'll be splitting this up into 2 episodes. But I think it would be important, just as you did in the book, that you follow a chronology. So I don't want it to get interrupted. So I'm thinking at the halfway mark, we can start with Madame Blavatsky or anything before her, but also moving through these stages and theosophy and all of it, moving towards to Dianetics. And because I don't want the flow of that to be interrupted, because that's the piece that's been missing. And you're right, just the noticing, and this is why it's so important to study history and to make connections between things so people understand where it came from. And also if it's from some place that's valid or from some place that's just hateful, or that is in the need to be superior so that you don't have psychological annihilation. I mean, it's just from an insecure place, right? It's not a real fact. And so all of that really matters very much to me, especially with my family having Holocaust history. The whole I'm better than you, so the rest of you are vermin, so you can be exterminated. And you mentioned that in your book as well. I do want to mention, before we get into going back in time, which I want there to be a special effect for the going back in time, but which we will do.
Right zone.
Nice. Very nice. But right, this is I mean, there's so many times that I hear about things that are factual. I wish it were a Twilight Zone episode. I wish, but it's real, unfortunately. When we talk about, Scientology, where I know we're moving forward in the story, and then we will go back, where he's fighting against the reactive mind, which I've always found so interesting, because the reactive mind, I think, is your safety net. It's the thing that guides you, that lets you know something is happening, something is off. To a certain degree, you can be overly reactive, you can be able to be stoked into anger. But if you dull your reactive mind completely, then you don't sometimes know you're being abused. You don't know that what's happening to you is that you're being put through endangerment in some way. I also feel like, L. Ron Hubbard and David Miscavige and others are so pugnacious, so reactive. They're like this, and the other day, this term popped into my head for L. Ron Hubbard, and probably also it's suitable for David Miscavige, the pugnacious prince of platitudes. I was in an alliteration mood, but it's just sort of fit. But I think that there is something about robbing people of their ability to respond that is something that's going to keep them from noticing what's happening to them. So going back to this quote that you just said, that, people can believe what they like. Yes, but if what they're being taught to believe is actually handicapping them, then no, I don't think that they've signed up for that. They've not been fully informed, so they can't make a fully informed decision until you can make a fully informed decision, until not only are you given all the information, but the intention is transparent about why you need to believe this. Then I think it's fine for people to believe what they like. But also if you have this sort of woven in, as you talked about it, Gestapo in Scientology with people who are writing the KRs, the knowledge reports, and keeping people in line, then no, that you don't have the freedom to believe what you like. You have to believe this. You have to behave this way. So where is the freedom in that? So I feel like that argument doesn't apply here at all. So when people are coming to their defense, it doesn't fit here.
Yeah, and let me clarify my thought, which is that we can't legislate against belief, that people, there should be an absolute freedom of belief. However, once that belief crosses into harm or incitement to harm, as I say, we have laws about hate speech in the UK. Once you are saying that somebody should be harmed, and our hate speech laws were tightened up after a man called Omar Bakri, who features in my book Opening Our Minds, preached that Tony Blair, our Prime Minister, should be killed. We've just in fact seen Elon Musk make a presentation which was played in London to a crowd of more than 100,000 people, saying that they should overthrow the government. Now, I don't think anybody's going to stop him, but I do think that at the point where your belief becomes something that is inciting violence in others and harm towards others, then it should be legal protection there. That is quite proper, I believe. So I think we probably believe pretty much the same thing. The problem is that we don't have an educational system, with the exception of some of the many independent schools, the Waldorf schools not being among them. We don't have an educational system that teaches how to understand the world, how to communicate, how to have relationships with people, and how to determine whether somebody is or isn't an authority on what they speak. I mean, I've had this thing going on for about a year and a half ago. Sean McCraney, this guy who's a reformed sociopath, who's quite fascinating. We did a podcast and he said, I've got this great book by Nasir Ghaemi called A First-Rate Madness. And he's a psychiatrist at Tufts. He's a professor at Tufts. He's Harvard Med School, has a mood disorders clinic, has a degree in history. And Sean was, this is a brilliant book because it shows that people who are, mentally ill make great leaders. And I'm kind of, I don't like the sound of that. So the guy's got all of the authority you could need, professor at Tufts, Harvard Med School, history degree. And he starts saying things which are complete nonsense. So as far as I'm concerned, so for example, that William Tecumseh Sherman was a great leader during the American Civil War. And I'm kind of going, the problems that Sherman created, not only during the Civil War, but in the annihilation of the Plains people when he was chief of the Bureau. This guy's meant to be a historian. I'm not. I don't have any training in this, but I know about Sherman's life. Yes, he was bipolar, manic depressive, which Nasir Ghaemi specializes in. He's an expert on this subject. And he thinks that burning out Atlanta and Savannah won the war and was a positive thing. And I say, America is still suffering from what Sherman did there. So no, not true. And he gives 7 other examples, and I think he's wrong with all of them. So you sometimes get this thing, not only are kids not taught to decide whether the internet podcaster who was a celebrity on a reality TV show, or Tom Cruise or somebody is an expert that you can trust. We don't teach that. We don't teach what used to be called rhetoric, where you learn how to analyze, break down into the parts, evaluate what you've got, and then express or articulate what you found. There's nothing there anymore. And kids, I think our society in the last 50 years has significantly dumbed down, especially with our attention being grabbed. The agents of commerce, businesses, corporations, want us to remain in adolescence, want us to remain, to look like 18-year-olds, to behave like 18-year-olds, to feel inferior that we aren't 18 years old, which, I can remember being 18 years old. It was awful. I would never go back to adolescence. It was the most horrible time. But keeping us dependent, keeping us, here's a new game for you to play on your video console. Here's a new horror movie for you to watch. Here's something else about serial killers. All of this where, 150 years ago, you might be offered, I don't know, a couple of thousand words in a day. We're now bombarded with something like 100,000 words a day from the various sources, the billboards, the TV, all of this stuff. We're deluged with this. We weren't taught how to deal with that information overload. We weren't taught how to trust or not trust. And we still tend, I'm reading a new book about Werner Erhard, Marsha Martin, and which I'm very equivocal about because she's selling her skills as a guru still while, having been one of the creators of this. And it's clear in the first pages, and she's quite open about it, that Werner Erhard is pretty. Werner Erhard is handsome. He is lovely. And that was, Ron Hubbard never understood why Erhard had been able to take Scientology and make so much money out of it. I talked to somebody who was infiltrated into us by Scientology to try and find out. And you're going, it's just not pretty, Ron. It's that simple. And we are that stupid that the Kennedy effect, as some social scientists call it, we will go for somebody because we like the look of them. And it's like, oh no. Because actually some of the most helpful human beings have not, like Socrates was held to be the ugliest man of his time, So don't put his face on posters. That's my advice.
I see. Right. Well, it's interesting also with the visuals. I mean, we are in a very visual era. And I think about, thousands of people I've worked with from probably now 1,000 different kinds of groups, where the person who was doing the recruiting was someone chosen because they were pretty, because they were charismatic, because they were inviting, because they had a nice smile. And so the words sometimes matter less. Also, the visuals that you pointed out, so interesting in your book about the symbols, the subtle, sometimes not so subtle, kind of way of convincing people that there is something connected because there is a similar cross, because there's similar colors. There's a letter that looks like this letter. And, it's...
Scientology uses what looks like a Christian cross. It isn't. Right. There is, Hubbard was absolutely derisive about Christianity. It's an implant. It's a made-up thing. There was no Christ. I quote Hubbard exactly. There was no Christ. And yet, dog collars on the ministers, the cross, to use that symbol to get past an evaluation of what you're really being presented with, which is fundamentally exactly the opposite of what good Christianity preaches.
Right. Yeah. And there are some symbols also that signify medical distinctions that also look like some of the Scientology symbols. And it gives you this air of validity, of safety. It really is quite incredible. It's like the actors in commercials who are wearing lab coats, but they're just extras, but they are selling a product. And the lab coat was in the room with the costumes, but you think it's a doctor, a nurse, whomever speaking with you. And so you listen and you believe. And we are able to be very influenced, just, I think, in that multi-sensory way, like with the large meetings, the bonfires from the Hitler rallies and the nighttime rituals, and similar to the so many of the pomp and circumstance sort of gatherings, especially here in LA, that I remember, people going to and just becoming intoxicated because of the music and how rousing it was, and the visuals, and how much we are susceptible to that. And it's such an important thing for people to understand about themselves.
I understand, I went to the Isle of Wight Festival when I was 15 in 1970, and it was an incredible experience to be there with 600,000 people. And because there's a ferry, they could actually count how many were there. And of course you're lifted, and I had a very odd experience one day. It was the afternoon and I woke up lying in the field there, and Steppenwolf were on the stage playing Born to be Wild. And there was a ring of Hell's Angels doing the chicken wing dance all around me. And I did not get caught up in that, much as, Steppenwolf were great. But for the rest of it, I realized how easy it was to become part of the group. And the first expert on groups, Gustave Le Bon, said a crowd will always default to the lowest common denominator. It will always be the stupidest person in the crowd. That gives us the word mob, meaning a mobile crowd, I believe, etymologically originally. This idea that you can get a group of people and throw them at something. And realizing that susceptibility, if you want to think for yourself, do that in private. rather than signing the contract that salesman puts in front of you right now. Take it away, talk with your friends, look on the internet, because we get caught up in the heat of the moment. We get caught up in the euphoria of belonging, of that sociability.
Yeah, actually, going back to Twilight Zone, I do, every once in a while, things will remind me of certain episodes. And I know that Twilight Zone episodes, to a great degree, are based on human psychology. And there is an episode about people being roused into being a mob, a torch and pitchfork, quite literally holding torches, kind of mob. And part of the episode is that they no longer knew what they were fighting against and shouting for. They just knew that they had collective anger and outrage and fear. And that's the only thing they were clear about after a while, which is fascinating to me and troubling, of course, that we see how much we are able to be caught up. And also, I think about the people sometimes who will come to me and say, it was only because similar to Steve Hassan, I had an accident and I wound up in the hospital and I was separated from the group. Or during COVID, sometimes people got into groups because of COVID, because of wanting to connect, and other times they couldn't go to meetings anymore. And that just the break from that had the trance wear off, and they realized how desperate they were to actually get a break, but they didn't think they could, or they really felt like they were landing again, becoming themselves again, even just taking a day away. It is such good advice, actually, just to take that time, just to separate out.
My wife and I, it works out as 3 times a month, we have a day to ourselves. And during that day, we don't hash out problems. We don't talk about anything that's unpleasant. We drag out some Mahler and listen to a bit of that, and maybe a bit of Indian classical music. And we maybe read some poetry or something that we're interested in, maybe some of our own work. My wife's a novelist. And it's such an important and refreshing thing. And for me, we call it the Sabbath because that's what it represents. This time when, it's become so crazy. It's about all of these rules. It's about being who you are. It's about being away from the madding crowd and, celebrating what is good in your life. We have a sizable garden. We have an incredibly privileged life, and people are just so frantic that most of the people I know work a 7-day week now. That the phone's always there, the emails are coming through, the alerts are coming, and they're engaged. What I think of as anti-social media has really not helped the human race tremendously. That people can blurt out their nastiness, anonymously if they wish. It's just, what a mess we've got into with that.
Right. Oh my goodness, yes. I think about this sense of urgency and being raised with the Sabbath. And it's interesting because you slow down. There are things you just can't do. And when you're a child, it feels like a can't. And then when you become an adult, it's just this lovely respite and you get to do other things. But the urgency doesn't have to be there. The urgency very often, unless your home is on fire or you are on fire, other things can wait. If someone is in cardiac arrest, fine. Yes, right. But our media pushes this urgency. I think about Robert Cialdini so often, this idea of scarcity and, you have to make this commitment to something now because you'll not have this opportunity come up again. Just what it does physiologically to you. And it's so unfair, but this is what cults do to people, but consistently without any kind of respite, which is entirely unhealthy. I know when we speak next, when the next part of our conversation is aired, we're going to talk more about the history, but I think it is so important to be able to talk to you about these subjects. And I also want to say, and the next time we're having this conversation, this next part of our conversation, you're going to do a lot more talking than I am because I really want to just listen. There is something that even in the title of your book, which is very dramatic because these thoughts are very dramatic, right? And they are what they are. I mean, sex, magic, and occultism, Nazism. I mean, it conjures so much feeling. But it was interesting as I'm thinking about all these things, at the very core, it's just this very human need to fight against fear, to feel powerful, to feel connected. I mean, it's primal and it's very real and it's very human, even though it can sound dramatic, but really at its base, it's not.
Yeah, it was a clickbait title, but only accidentally so, because I do actually talk about all the things. I
Yeah,
was thinking
you
about
do.
adding kittens and golf and some recipes, but we'll maybe do that in the next edition.
Next, yeah.
And seeing the connection, and the hypothesis that began the book, which we will get to next, but if Scientology ruled the world, if any of these authoritarian groups, and the reality is authoritarian groups do rule the world, authoritarian corporations, which are not in the least bit democratic, not in the least bit concerned for human rights, are ruling the world. Political groups are ruling the world out of ideologies which are bereft of understanding of human need, which are not about making the world a better place, but are about scraping up as much profit as they can and as much influence as they can. There's a simple formula, which is if somebody comes to you with an idea or a product, they are trying to sell it to you. Now, they may have the very best motivations. When I was recruiting people in Scientology, I thought I was bringing them into the most wonderful, world-changing movement. And that's a problem. It's not, it comes over as genuine because it isn't a scam. But behind the recruiter, it is, and as we have found.
Right. And I think that adds to the moral injury of it all. Right.
Yes, that you come away from it going, what did I do? And people get very confused, as you know, about the terrible things they did or the terrible things that were done to them. Getting them to the place where they can accept that they did terrible things and that was wrong, and that terrible things were done to them. It wasn't entirely, their own motivation to do these things to other people. They were pushed into doing it. But that balance is very difficult, and some people will never accept responsibility for the harm they did, and other people will never be able to get over the harm they did. And finding that balance and saying, I do believe in redemption, that when somebody leaves a group and they were a core member, recruiting people, harming people, doing things to people, if they want to now say that and talk about that, we should encourage them. We shouldn't be throwing brickbats at them to shut them up, telling about their experience and allowing forgiveness if they come to the point where they ask for forgiveness. Of course, it's not something you can grant until it can be accepted. But
I absolutely agree with you, because so many groups, even religious groups, will tell you have to forgive. And I do think it should be based on merit, right? It's not just yet another task or an order you give to the harmed person in the story.
No, I couldn't agree more.
So, right. Okay. So lovely to start this conversation with you. And, I cannot wait for it to continue. Always good to talk to you. Okay.
Yes, it's always a great pleasure, Rachel.
To be continued, ...